Today we're talking about solving 1 and 2 step equations. This is all review from 6th and 7th grade. But if you don't have these skills, the this unit will be very difficult. So that's why we're taking the time to make sure that everyone has these skills. So before we get started, we gotta start off with the essential question. So our essential question is how do I use inverse operations to solve 1 and 2 step equations? So remember, inverse operations are just means opposite of. So if I'm adding, the inverse is subtracting. So if I'm adding, the inverse will be to subtract. If I'm subtracting, the inverse is to add. If I'm multiplying, the inverse is dividing. If I'm dividing, the inverse is multiplying. All right, so we're going to use these skills to help us solve one-step equations at first. So if we have x plus 4 equals 7, what I'm going to do, draw my wall. And then it's x plus 4. So the way I kind of do it, I'll have students kind of like cover this x up or cover up the variable. Some people like to circle it. You could just cover it up. And then what do I see left over on the left side? Well, I see a plus 4. So what I'm going to do is do the inverse. So instead of adding 4, the inverse of adding is subtracting. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So minus 4. And then this forms a 0. That's a 0. Then I drop down the x because nothing happened to it. And then now I just calculate, well, what's 7 minus 4? Well, I know that 7 minus 4 is 3. And that's it. That's a one-step equation because it took one inverse operation to solve it. Then the next one, we have x minus 4 equals 7. So x minus 4 equals 7. So you could just do the same process. Circle the variable, draw your wall. Then I'm looking. So sometimes you just take your finger and cover the variable up. So imagine this is a finger. Just cover up the variable. And then what do I see left over? That's not covered. Well, I see a minus 4. I also see a 7, but I don't care about the 7 right now because it's not on the same side as the variable. So I'm cover that up. I see a negative 4. So the inverse of subtracting 4 will be to add 4. So from inverse of subtracting is to add 4. So I will add 4 to both sides. Just like that. And then these form a 0. Then I drop down the x, bring down the equal sign, and then now I figure out, well, what's 7 plus 4? 7 plus 4 is 11. So you get 11. Then that's it. Then we go on to the next one. Same process. You could cover up or circle the variable. Circle the variable, draw your wall. Same process. And then now this one is a little bit different. We have 3x equals 27. So if there's a number and a variable, that always means multiplication. So if I see something like this, like 3x, that means 3 times x. That means 3 times x. So what's the inverse operation of multiplying? Well, if I look at this, if I'm multiplying, the inverse is division. So I'm going to divide. But what am I dividing by? Well, what's the number in front of x? In this problem, it's a 3. So I'm going to divide by 3. So divide by 3 on both sides. And then this forms a 1. So I have like a 1 right here. And so I have x equals. I don't have to write down that 1. There's like an invisible 1 in front, but I don't have to write that down. And then 27 divided by 3. 27 divided by 3. Just do some little math. You should get 9. Just like that. Then the next one, x divided by 2 equals 13. Every time I see a fraction like this, that means division. So same process every single time. Circle the variable, draw your wall. So that fraction means that it's division, right? So if we're dividing, then the inverse will be to multiply. The inverse of division is multiplication. So I'm dividing by 2, so it's x divided by 2. So the opposite or the inverse operation will be then to multiply by 2, but on both sides. So when I multiply by 2, that forms a 1. So I'm left with the x, but I don't have to write 1x, right? I don't need to write 1x. I just write x. And then 13 times 2 is 26. Then that's that. So those were some basic examples of solving one-step equations. So now let's get a little bit more difficult. So now in the next example that I tried, number 1, is negative 4h equals negative 20. So same process. Who cares if it's negative, right? Same process. Circle the variable, draw your wall. So just like the multiplication example, every time I see a number and a variable right next to each other, that means multiplication. So the inverse of multiplication is to divide, right? That means to divide. So I'm gonna divide. But now, instead of just dividing by a regular number, it's a negative number this time. So same process. So there's a negative 4 in front. So I'm gonna divide by negative 4. It still forms a 1. So I'm gonna have my 1. Then we'll write h. I don't have to write 1h, right? And then negative 20 divided by negative 4. A lot of people make this mistake. Use your dead man's face. Use dead man's face. So if I have this is only for multiplication and division. So a negative and a negative together. So negative and negative equal a positive. A negative and negative together equal a positive when you're multiplying or dividing. So that means my answer for this will be positive. Then 20 divided by 4 is 5. Or you could write it as h equals 5. Pause the video and try number 1. And then once you're done, you could unpause it and move on. All right, so next example. Now we're getting into two-step equations. So two-step equations means that it requires 2 inverse operations. So same process, draw your wall, circle the variable. So what I like to do, cover up the variable and what's in front of it with your finger. Then what do I see left over that's not covered? Well, I see a negative 1. I see a negative 1 not covered. So the inverse of subtracting 1 is to add 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And then that forms a 0. So I'm going to bring down everything else. I have 2x. And then 1 plus 5 is 6. And now this is just like that one-step equation. It's just like the multiplication example up top. So I have a number and a variable right next to each other. Circle it. I'm going to divide by 2 on both sides. That forms a 1. So I have x equals, and what's 6 divided by 2? Well, 6 divided by 2 is 3. That's my final answer. And then the next example, example B, same process. Draw your wall, circle the variable. I'm going to cover up the variable and everything that's with it. What do I see left over? Well, I see a negative 2. I don't care if that's a fraction. All right? A lot of people see fractions and they get all, I don't know what happens. But same process, cover up the variable and everything that's with it. I see a negative 2 that's not covered. So I'm going to do the inverse. That's to add 2 to both sides. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. Draw your wall. That forms a 0. Then I'm left with all this. I'm going to bring x over 5 equals, and then 3 plus 2 is 5. And then my last step, if I look up top, this looks like that division example. Exact same thing. Exact same process. So I have x over 5. So x over 5. So that means division. So the inverse of division is multiplication. So I'm going to multiply on both sides, but I'm going to multiply by 5. And then this forms a 1. So I have x equals, I don't have to write 1x. I could just write x. And then 5 times 5 is 25. And then I'm done. And then you could just move on. All right, example C. Same process. Circle my variable. Draw my wall. Now I see a fraction. So I see this fraction bar. So it's this divided by 3. 7 minus x all divided by 3. So when I see this, it becomes a little bit funky. So if I see a fraction, that means division. So the inverse of division will be to multiply. So I'm going to multiply both sides. Well, by what number? Well, in this case, it'll be 3. This forms a 1. I'm going to drop down everything that wasn't affected. So it'll be 7 minus x equals, then 9 times 3 is 27. And then same process, circle the variable. I'm going to cover up the variable with my finger. And then what's not affected? Well, I see a 7 that's there. A 7 that's not affected. So the inverse of a positive 7 will be to subtract 7. The inverse of a positive is a negative, so it'll be subtracting 7 on both sides. That forms a 0. So I have negative x. Don't forget that negative. That negative drops down with it. And then 27 minus 7 is 20. But I'm not done yet. I have negative x equals 20. Negative x equals 20. So just a reminder, remember we have that invisible 1 in front of x. And just like that multiplication example, when there's a number and a variable right next to each other, that means multiplication. So the inverse of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide by negative 1 on both sides. And then these form a 1. So I have x equals 20 divided by negative 1. Well, anything divided by 1 is itself. Then by dead man's face, a positive divided by a negative, remember, is a negative. So I have negative 20. Then the last example, example D, I have 2 times x minus 3 equals 8. There's 2 ways of doing this. So I'll show you guys both ways. So I'm going to write this twice and show you guys both ways. Both of them have their benefits. Okay. So I'll call this 1 and 2. So the first way is using the distributive property. So if I circle this, so from the previous notes, I just use the distributive property. I multiply everything on the inside by everything on the outside, by what's on the outside. So 2 times x and 2 times negative 3. So this becomes 2 times x minus 2 times 3 equals 8. Then I just do my multiplications and I have 2x minus 6 equals 8, right? Because 2 times 3 is 6. Then now this becomes a 2-step equation. Draw my wall. If I cover up the variable with my finger, right? Remember, you could draw a circle around the variable if that helps. So if I cover that up, I see a negative 6 that's left over. So the inverse of subtracting 6 is to add 6. So I will add 6 to both sides. So that forms a 0. So I have 2x equals 8 plus 6 is 14. Then my last step, this is just multiplication. So 2x is just multiplication. So the inverse of multiplication is division. So I'll divide by 2. Then I get x equals 14 divided by 2 is 7. So that's one way. That's using the distributive property and then turning it into a 2-step equation. The other way, if I look at this is 2 times x minus 3. This is 2 times x minus 3 equals 8. So remember, this is multiplication, right? So that is multiplication. So what's the inverse of multiplication? Well, I know the inverse of multiplication is division, so I will divide both sides. But what am I dividing by? Well, I'm going to look at what's in front. Well, what's in front is that 2. So I'm going to divide by 2 on both sides. Then that forms a 1, but I don't have to write that 1, right? I just bring down the x minus 3. Then 8 divided by 2 is 4. And then now this becomes a one-step equation. You go circle the variable. If I cover up the variable, I see a -3. So the inverse of subtracting 3 will be to add 3 to both sides. So I will add 3 to both sides. Then I have x equals 7. In both answers, I get the same, or in both methods, I get the same answer. So either way is useful. You could use either way, and they both have their benefits. All right, then on the back side, it is your job to complete all these problems before you move on to IXL. Make sure that you complete all these problems. Once you're done with all these problems, raise your hand and let me know. I'll come around and stamp them. I'll check them, and then if they're all correct and you're good to go, I'll come and stamp it, and I'll stamp it around this location, signifying that you've completed all these problems, and then you'll go on IXL. Remember, the IXL standards that we're working on for whatever notes we're doing is always on top of the notes, always these standards, and you're always going to try to shoot for a score of an 80 or more, so 80 plus for both. Whatever you don't finish is always done for homework. And then once you've scored an 80, take out that yellow sheet, then I'll stamp it to give you credit